Jonathan Nee is a professor in media and technology and co-director of the media and technology program at Columbia Business School. He serves as a senior advisor at Evercore, an investment banking advisory firm. Prior to Evercore, he was a managing director and co-head of Morgan Stanley's media group and was previously publishing sector head in the communications, media, and entertainment group at Goldman Sachs. He serves on multiple boards, such as New Alternatives for Children, the National Women's Law Center, and the Citizens Committee for Children of New York. And he's also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. His writing appears in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic. He's the author of several best-selling books, most recently, The Platform Delusion, Who Wins and Who Loses in the Age of Tech Titans, which shows how the principles of competitive advantage in a company-to-company context, a company-to-company context, translate or don't to the world of platforms. And we're excited to see how his thinking might apply to ecosystems. And our central question here is, do the key success factors and sources of competitive advantage in one area apply to the other? Jonathan, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So I am very intrigued and absolutely believe in your approach to competitive advantage, maybe because I also studied at Columbia Business School. But could you kind of briefly lay out what you see, if we talk about the company-to-company competition, what do you see as the primary sources of competitive advantage that determines who wins, who loses?
So I guess where I'd start with is, what is a competitive advantage? It's something that one competitor can do that gives them an advantage over others. Implicitly, that means the other person can't do it, or
Yes.
finds it more difficult, or to do it, it would not be as good, it would cost more, or otherwise. Otherwise, it's not an advantage.
Yeah.
Another phrase that people isn't as sexy, but if you think about it, is really the same thing, is a barrier to entry. Because if there is no barrier to entry, you have no advantage. That is, somebody else can come and do it and copy it, and you might have a good run for a while, but if there is fundamentally no barrier to entry and you're getting supernormal returns by doing something fabulous, people will notice and they will come after you, and over time those supernormal returns will go away. So the question is, what are the specific barriers, the specific advantages that allow companies to outperform over a long period of time? And the short answer is that it's not a really long list. People are forever describing things as competitive advantage. It's, my company has the most talented people and that's our advantage. Well, guess what? If they're talented and not stupid, they'll bid themselves out to the person who's going to pay the most for them. And the shareholders are not going to be the ones who get the benefit. So there are a lot of things that are described as advantages that aren't. But what I would say is, to be a great franchise, to be a great business, you need multiple sources of advantage reinforcing each other for it to be really sustainable. Because if you just have one, somebody's going to figure it out and it's going to come down sooner than you think. But what I
Yes.
would say is that the base advantage, more often than not, on which the reinforcing advantages are built, is typically scale.
Okay.
And scale is not what people think it is. People think of scale and they think really, really big. And there are plenty of really, really big companies that don't deliver superior results and never will and can't, because there are lots of really, really big companies of similar size with similar advantages, and they just compete the hell out of each other. And some may do better than others because they're better operators, but that is not a competitive advantage. Scale is a relative concept. The benefits of scale come from being bigger than the next guy or gal. And that can be within a really tight small market or geography, in which case it doesn't need to be a very big company, but
Because
it'll
the
be
market then defines the competition. So as long as
exactly,
I'm bigger, that yeah.
exactly. So uh, a local, in the old days, a local newspaper, there's only one, there's only one, it only supports one of scale. It's got a 40% margin. Or a niche software business that serves a very, very particular function within businesses, and one person figures it out quickly. Everybody realizes this is the best product available for that function. Everybody in that industry talks to each other. All of a sudden, they've got 40% market share. They have relative scale. What is the source of benefit from having relative scale? And
Okay.
here is where being in digital environments changes that. But the fundamental advantage is the same. The fundamental advantage is scale.
Okay.
Historically, the benefits of scale came from significant fixed costs, because if you have significant fixed costs in the business, being twice as big as the next guy, you're going to be able to spread those costs over twice as many units, and your average cost is going to be lower than the competitors, and your profitability will be greater. Okay. That there are others, but that is the fundamental structural benefit of being bigger than the next guy. But that has important implications. If you're a business where it's all a marginal cost business, that is, there is no significant fixed
Fixed
costs.
costs.
The fact that you're bigger actually could be a disadvantage because it makes it harder for you to operate efficiently and manage it effectively. Okay.
Interesting.
But
Yeah.
that's historically the source. In a digital world and in a networked world, there's a different benefit that you see more often than you used to.
Okay.
Now, it existed before. The phone company, AT&T, the original AT&T had this other benefit of being the biggest network, but that was on the revenue side, and that is where, because you're bigger, with every additional customer, the product itself gets better.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you have a phone system that has 5 people on it, well, it's valuable, but those 5 people can talk to each other. But it's really exciting when their best friend joins, and a sixth person joins, and all of a sudden the value to all of the previous participants of that product has gone up, and every additional person who joins the network makes the existing product better. And
Yep.
when a new person is thinking about, well, which network should I join, he'll be more likely to, he'll say, geez, the one that's got more people to talk to, that's the one I'm going to join. And then when he does join, it even gets better. And that's what they call the flywheel effect, or the virtual circle of network effects. But notice that has nothing to do with fixed costs. That has
Yes.
to do, it's not on the cost side, it's actually on the revenue side and on the demand side.
Yes.
And in the digital environments, people have noticed that differently, the percentage or the frequency with which the scale advantages manifest themselves on the revenue side is higher, simply because you're operating in a digital environment. So that is the base advantage. But either of those flavors of advantage by themselves is not that great, because they're vulnerable to being copied. And when you say that, you say, well, why?
Just one clarification question to make sure people are following. So what you're saying is that those are two different versions of scale advantage.
That's
Network
right.
effect is still
Those are
scale advantage.
different manifestations, different
Expectations. Okay.
benefits. So but if you only have scale, it is prone to being chipped away. You need to have additional advantages. And the two main sources of additional advantage are, some kind of stickiness, some kind of customer captivity, so that if somebody says, geez, that looks like a great business, I'll borrow a bunch of money and I'll make something just as good, and I'll offer the same thing, and or maybe even a little better, and I'll get half of the customers. But if there's customer captivity, if
Mhm.
people have if there's a switching cost, if there's a habit, if there's some other thing that will keep you there,
Mhm.
actually you're not going to get half. All the incumbent needs to do is match everything you do,
Right.
and you're going to keep everybody because there's
Got it.
captivity. Okay.
Got it. Got it.
But so having captivity is important, and unfortunately, the thing about digital environments is it makes it harder to have captivity because it's easier to switch in
Mm.
cumbersome analog environments. And the historic great business franchises tended to be scale, whose benefit came from big fixed costs, reinforced by customer captivity. It was too hard to switch. It was too complicated. People were too used to it, and they were to be willing to make a change without something radically different. And that was the source of historical advantage.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
a digital environment where picking a new source to buy something is literally a click away, as opposed to having to drive to Queens to the
Mhm.
or something like that, where the captivity is obvious. Well, that becomes a little bit more an increasing vulnerability. And so in digital environments, where what you often see is that the reinforcing advantage is not customer captivity necessarily or as strongly, but actually it comes from the data that being in a digital environment allows the incumbent to collect. And by
Mhm.
having that data, it's able to move quickly down the learning curve and constantly improve the product, and in some cases also customize the product to reflect the needs of the customer, as a way potentially to compensate for the lack of customer captivity that comes with people being able to switch quickly.
Yep.
You're offering something else that maybe fills in that gap with something else that some others won't be able to deliver because they don't know you as well.
Got it. Yes.
Now, even there's a problem, which is the fact is in digital environments, it doesn't take very long for other people to know you pretty quickly. That
Oh,
is,
I see.
even with a few interactions, they might be able to replicate that. But that's broadly the dynamic. So you want scale, and then you want to reinforce it with either customer captivity or some kind of cost advantage learning, whether that's from big data or AI or what have you.
Okay.
But interestingly, what you see frequently when you hear people talk about these different manifestations of the same advantage, because as you pointed out, the advantage is scale, the core advantage. And people are saying, well, what's better? A demand side network effects advantage, or an old school fixed cost advantage, as if these two things are in some kind of grudge
Mhm.
match at
They're
the
mutually exclusive.
yeah
Yep.
but that's not right, the right way to think about it. The reality is actually digital businesses that have network effects, and remember, people frequently say, oh, I've got network effects, so it's good news.
Mhm.
Well, remember, what's good news is having scale. Right.
Hmm.
So if you're the biggest,
Then your network effect is
and then your network
Hmm.
effects are valuable. But if you're not the biggest,
Right. Right.
actually, it's a disadvantage, right? It's a
Huh. Why is that?
competitive disadvantage because you are smaller,
Mm.
and your network is smaller. So
Really?
that's you should not be broadcasting that because that's not a good thing. That's bad news. So the interesting dynamic, though, is in networks where there are very few fixed costs, the break-even economics of having a network are, by definition, quite low.
Mm-hmm.
And that suggests, particularly if you don't have strong customer captivity, that you're going to have a bunch of competing networks bidding against each other for customers and for
Mm-hmm.
network participants, which will be good for the network participants potentially, but it's not going to be good for the business. You
Yes.
want to have a meaningful fixed cost base so that the break-even economics
Yep.
of operating the network ensures that there aren't
Could be
it's
too
not going to
many
be
networks.
it's
Yeah.
not going to be too many. So it's
Yeah.
not a question of one or the other. It's a question of, do I have a business where scale actually manifests itself in both meaningful fixed costs and network effects, so that you
Mhm.
have a resilient, a potentially more resilient franchise. And obviously, the other sources of advantages could even reinforce them more. That is through customer captivity or learning or data. So those are the sort of collection of advantages, but they
Is
tend to be built at base on scale.
so so my simplified understanding of the model also has like preferential access to resources or
Yep.
suppliers at the back end. Is is that
Yeah. So,
that's
but so access to resource is another. I always try to keep it simple, because I mean,
mm,
again, you're only talking about a handful. So to me, the one that is most frequent is at the core is scale, and then
mhm,
I think of demand side advantages and supply side advantages as really the two categories. And
okay,
access to resources is actually is a specific supply side advantage. You can
yeah,
think of it as a
okay,
separate category, but it allows you to deliver product
yeah,
cheaper.
okay, great. So, if we take those advantages and you have in your book translated them into a platform to platform model, but if we take that now to the next step, we talk ecosystem to ecosystem, right? We're talking about the SAP system ecosystem versus the Microsoft ecosystem. We're talking about the Silicon Alley versus Silicon Valley. We're talking about the Star Alliance versus, whatever. We have this ecosystem based, and so we kind of look at these two ecosystems and figure out which one is going to win, and so therefore which one do we want to align with, or how can we set up our ecosystem, give it the best chance of success. um, could you try to in my simplified thinking, I'm thinking, okay, scale advantages means there's some fixed cost. So in the ecosystem, there has to be a certain amount of fixed cost in order for the break-even point for an ecosystem to be high enough that it will preclude another ecosystem or too many ecosystems from entering or forming. Um, and I
So
certainly
yeah,
see the
so I
network
think
effect
so.
too,
I
right?
think you're so so the way to think about the framework is, at the end of the day, whatever it is,
Mhm.
if other people can do it, it's not going to be so great. Okay, that's what competitive advantage is about. And now
Mm.
we've talked about a pretty finite list of potential advantages, right? Scale,
Yep.
demand side, supply side,
Yep.
basically.
Yep.
Um, so you say, well, that's really easy. Well, it's not really easy. It's pretty complicated. And what's complicated and what's interesting is how those advantages are likely to manifest in different environments.
Hmm.
So the platform delusion is about, in large part, how they are likely to manifest in the context of platform business models, and when they are and when they manifest, and when they don't.
And
And
just
what are
just for the
so,
audience, like the platform we're talking about, Facebook, Netflix,
yeah.
Google, those
So
kinds
what?
of platform models.
Actually, just to connect it to the concept of ecosystem, because it's kind of overlapping Venn diagram.
Sure.
So, an ecosystem is uh, well, you should probably define it, but it is the environment within which, and all of its constituents within which a certain defined kind of economic activity takes place.
Hmm.
So it's what you're doing, it's your suppliers, it's your customers, it's your competitors, it is
Your
the world within.
compliments as
Right,
well.
it is your right, it's complements. um, it's the world within which you operate.
Yeah.
um, Now, a platform business is a business whose core value proposition is not about what it makes. It's not manufacturing something or providing a particular service. It is about the connections it enables and enhances. So it is in the connection business or the enhancing the connection business. So that
Hmm.
means an operating system that connects software developers and users. That means a marketplace that connects buyers and sellers, to your example of Facebook, or the example, frankly, of the phone system. It's a
Hmm.
social network that connects different, friends and family. But the core value proposition is about the connections you make.
Connection.
And how you enhance those connections, and ultimately monetize them. So it's a particular kind of business model. It's been around forever, right?
Hmm.
You think about middlemen businesses in, back in the Middle East, right? You're
Hmm.
connecting.
Traders and
Right, traders, or the woman whose job it was to find your daughter a husband,
hmm
right? I mean,
hmm
you're creating value by making connections, right? And
hmm
or even just a real estate broker. Now, people try to sex this up, and because apparently the public markets give you a couple of extra turns if you call
hmm
yourself a platform.
Yeah.
So a business like Compass, which is essentially a real estate brokerage,
Hmm.
it's a good one. It's technology enabled, but when they went public in their S1, they used the word platform 300 times, right? I mean, because it's a platform. I want to,
Hmm.
I'm gonna. That's 10 times revenue. Um,
Hmm.
but often, unfortunately, though, so at least there, that's just a question of hyperbole. But where you get into the thing that we professors don't like, which is where you're actually misleading or confusing the underlying concept, is where you call things that aren't platforms platforms. So,
Hmm.
for instance, the SEC did not let um, Sweet Greens use the language they used in their marketing materials when they were just raising money privately. But when they raised money privately, they told people they were a food platform.
Okay.
They're not a food platform. They're they're a fast food restaurant. They sell food,
Yeah.
right? They're not connecting eaters with farmers, right?
Yeah.
Right. Similarly, Netflix. People are always saying Netflix is a platform. It's not.
Hmm.
YouTube is a platform. It is connecting viewers with content creators, and its value proposition is in the connection and the enhancement of that connection
Hmm.
by good search tools, other sorts of things. Netflix is a retailer, just like Sweetgreen is a retailer. It
Hmm.
buys and it makes content and it sells it as a subscription. So it's not a
Hmm.
platform. So that's what a platform business is. So going to the concept of ecosystem, many of these platforms are effectively ecosystems, right?
Okay.
They define at least a significant portion. They're actually they're in the business of operating an ecosystem, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Whether that ecosystem, might be, I don't know, Etsy operating the ecosystem uh, between folks who make and buy, uh, uh, handmade goods. Now, as you define ecosystem, there are others in that ecosystem, but their fundamental role in that circumstance
Hmm.
is about operating the core of the ecosystem.
Like kind of
But
defining the rules of engagement.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly, and monetizing it. So but interesting, there are businesses that are both operating the ecosystem and a participant in the ecosystem. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so if we take the extreme example of uh, so YouTube and Netflix, where one is clearly a platform and one isn't, there are a number of business models where the person who operates the platform also participates in it.
Okay.
Amazon is a fabulous example of that, right?
Mhm.
So when Amazon started, for the first almost 10 years of its life, it wasn't a platform at all. It was just a store that happened to be a digital store. They had big warehouses, they bought stuff, and they sold it. Okay.
Yep.
But then they created Amazon marketplaces where they sit and connect people who have their own stores to buyers, and then they put it on the same page on Amazon. So Amazon is effectively, as a retailer itself, is competing with a marketplace that it operates. And then it goes one more. It actually becomes a manufacturer with Amazon Basics.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so it sells its own product.
Yep.
It buys and sells as a retailer other people's product.
Yep.
And it manages third-party marketplaces for others, and it does it all on
Mhm.
one place. Actually, if you think about the video game business is quite similar in the
Uh-huh.
sense that in the it started really as you're trying to sell hardware, but you're
Mhm.
trying to sell the hardware. You need to attract enough developers who are going to develop for your hardware so that you attract enough customers. So you want to be you're trying to be a platform business, but
Yes.
in order to seed that platform, these platforms are sometimes they're two-sided, usually they're multi-sided. There are lots of constituents, right?
Mhm.
But in order to do that, you need to have a bunch of really good content that you own yourself to attract enough users in the first instance to make third-party developers start to develop software for you. And
Yes.
even
Yeah.
where you have essentially, you know, take the two big operating systems, uh, uh, Android and the Apple operating system.
iOS. Yeah.
Even there, in certain instances, people don't certain things certain kinds of interactions with these operating systems, people don't multi-home. Why would I sell only on yours? If it's easy
Mhm.
enough, I'll sell on everybody's platform, or
Yeah.
I'll interact with them.
Yeah.
Whereas certain kinds of platforms, you end up saying, you know what, it's too complicated, it's too hard, I'm just going to do certain functions on
Yep.
one, right?
And that would be raising the switching costs on the supply side,
Correct.
right? Okay.
Correct. And but even there, um, the number of apps that are exclusive to one or the other of those app stores is, way less than 1%, right? The
Really?
vast, but again, that's because these two ecosystems are of such scale, it is clearly worth it to develop it for both of them, right? I
Okay.
remember, as you know, I love my keyboard. So I do still have I am one of the last people with a
BlackBerry
BlackBerry,
user?
but
Uh-huh.
mercifully they put the BlackBerry operating system out of its misery. But I haven't used that for many years. I have always used an Android system on a BlackBerry device for quite a long time. But when back when before it was clear that that was going to die, I remember calling a former analyst of mine as a banker who had risen up very high in Uber and said, "Hey, give a guy a break. Can you
Mhm.
develop an Uber app for the BlackBerry operating system?"
Okay.
And his answer was, "What's a BlackBerry?" So, it's not necessarily, you need to have a critical mass on your operating system for it to
Yeah.
be worth it to develop apps. And
Right.
since it's now a duopoly, it's basically, it would rarely be worth it to somebody
Then that,
not to develop it for both.
which kind of defines, or at least puts a minimum on the, I don't know, the break even scale point for a competitive ecosystem.
Yes.
So that has to be, that's defined by the switching costs of the people that are on a different ecosystem or a different
So yeah,
platform.
it's interesting. There's there's a there are two sides to minimum viability. One
Hmm.
is just the economics. Based on the fixed cost, is it going to be, how big do you have to be? How much activity do you have to have for it to be viable? But the other is on the product side.
Okay.
So, a good example to think about around the product side and minimum viability actually is Uber and Lyft.
Okay.
Because with a lot of network effects businesses, people think, oh, the more you have, the better it is ad infinitum. But it turns out that's not the case. You have to look at the use case. So
Okay.
think about when you're going to use Uber or Lyft. What do you care about? Well, you care about what it costs, and you care about whether the car is going to be able to get there in 4 to 5 minutes.
Yep.
But once the car can get there in, okay, maybe 3 to 5 minutes,
Hmm.
attracting more drivers onto the system doesn't make it better. Actually, it makes it a little worse, because if you're on the 43rd floor midtown, it's
Hmm.
going to take you 3 minutes to get downstairs. And if there are so many damn cars on the system that it'll be there in 5 seconds, and by the time you get there, they have charged you because you missed your window,
Right. Right. Right.
that's a bad thing, right? And
Yeah.
that has to do with the level of complexity and homogeneity versus homogeneity of the actual product. Because where the product is called, for lack of a better word, a commodity like, there
Okay.
aren't very many characteristics that matter. Okay, if it's a terrible jalopy, I mean, maybe, but people, you don't care if it's a 4.4 driver or 4.3
Sure.
driver. You
Sure.
care about what it costs and when it's going to be there. The level of liquidity of the marketplace, as it were, does not need to be, it doesn't keep getting better the more you have. If you have a few options
Mhm.
and it meets those things, that's plenty.
Yeah.
But
Diminishing marginal, whatever
that's right.
value or
So
something.
viability is that,
Mhm.
so the viability in terms of product viability, that it's something people would want,
Mhm.
happens much earlier. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, if you have a product where there are many characteristics that matter, and the more options you have, the better it is for you, and it keeps getting better. So think about Airbnb. I'm
Mhm.
staying in the seventh arrondissement.
Oh, right. Right.
I care about my view. I care about how big the bedrooms are. I care about how many bathrooms there are. I
Mhm.
care about, is there air conditioning? I care
Mhm.
about, is there an elevator? I care about which corner, whether it's on the big busy street or a small street. I
Right.
care about a whole bunch of things. So just having 3 apartments in the seventh arrondissement ain't going to get it done.
Right.
And frankly, even if I have 100, I would rather have 200. 200's better. I can. So
But it
because of that,
raises the barrier to entry for another platform because they
absolutely,
were gonna have to offer all the different permutations, and for that, they're gonna have a bigger base.
exactly,
Got it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
so we've been talking about ecosystems that are, where you have somebody who actually operates the ecosystem as their, or at least a big chunk of it, as their
Yes.
core business model. Now, but when you talk about ecosystems in the broader sense, where I'm just a business and I have to interact with my suppliers, my customers, my competitors, my complements, the different layers of the industry in which I operate, which usually has multiple different layers.
Yep.
As you think about that, that's a much more complicated question, and it's actually a both poorly understood and not focused on enough aspect of strategic decision making,
Mhm.
how you interact with the other people in your ecosystem.
Okay.
And in general, a good rule of thumb is, if you think of the potential, I mean, a good way to think about an ecosystem, I
Mhm.
find, is close your eyes and ask yourself, how would it be organized if there were no antitrust laws?
Mhm.
How would you organize it in the way to make the pie the biggest possible pie, right?
Mhm.
That is the both the usage and the profitability available. How would it be organized?
Yeah.
Would you all compete the shit out of each other and do, or would one of you be focused? Would there
Mhm.
be somebody who focuses on the small, somebody who focuses on the big? Would somebody specialize in, would there be certain layers of the ecosystem where scale actually does matter, in terms from a cost point of view, that
Mhm.
doesn't tap out at a certain level, and so that should become just a utility for the whole industry, for all the
Yes, yes,
competitors at
yes,
different
yes.
layers. So that mental experiment about how would this be organized in the most efficient way is a fabulous step one. And
Mhm.
then step back and say, okay, where are we today? And what are the ways we can get closer to that legally?
Yeah.
Um, I find that to be quite useful. And then the other
Mhm.
thing I would say is, just like, I've been a banker for 30 years, and like other professions, we're a delusional people. If you go around to all of the bankers at a firm and ask them, give them truth serum, and ask them, what percentage of the value at the firm are you delivering? And they put it in a hat, and everybody does that. When you add them all up, it'll add up to 400 or 500% of the value at the firm. Everybody has an overblown sense of their own importance. That
Mhm.
is a dangerous thing in an ecosystem, because the way that people in an ecosystem interact with each other,
Mhm.
and how much of the spoils that are available from that big old pie should be available to one layer or another layer,
Yes.
should be directly proportionate to what you're bringing to the party.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if at one layer it is just an intensely competitive industry,
Yep.
and it's a commodity industry, and there are going to be multiple scale players who are just competing against each other. If they get delusional about, well, I'm going to partner with one of the big guys in the next layer, and and it doesn't work that way. You only get to take what you bring.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and when people are delusional about what they're bringing, it makes it difficult to even legally make the
Mhm.
right kinds of signals that allow you to organize the ecosystem in a sensible way.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think very often, even people who are, so I think there are two big problems that you get in terms of, put aside antitrust laws, two big problems you get in terms of the way people manage ecosystems amongst themselves.
Mhm.
Problem one is people who aren't really bringing much to the party being delusional.
Uh-huh.
But problem too is people who are bringing a lot to the party being greedy
Okay.
and not taking the long view. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, you know, competitive advantage and barriers to entry are wonderful things, but nothing is forever.
Yes.
And it's in your interest to have the other people in to share the
Yeah.
spoils of your
Hmm.
benefits
Hmm.
with others in the ecosystem so that they conclude that it's actually in their interest
Yes.
to maintain the status quo, that they're
So
getting it, that the best alternative to the sharing arrangement that you put in place is
yes.
not as
Yes.
good, right?
Because I guess in the
And so they don't wake
beginning,
up every morning thinking, I want to, that guy's a son of a bitch. I
I wish
want
there
to
was an
take him out.
alternative, right?
Yeah,
So the beginning, you're the only game in town, so you have a lot of bargaining power, and so you're extracting more value than is really sustainable. And as Jeff Bezos says, your margin is my opportunity. Someone's going to look at that and say, "Hey, wait a second, I can put together an alternative, not extract as much, and it still is value
totally.
creating for me."
Totally. I
That
mean, a great example, actually, going back to this is old, but it's
Mhm.
a good example also from the game business. If you remember back in the day when Nintendo was it, they had, I mean,
Yeah,
the Nintendo, it was it,
yeah,
and it was the bomb. And so you need, I mean, you could not be Toys R Us. You need to have Nintendo. You need and if you're a game developer, and Nintendo knew it, and the way they dealt with it was just treated everybody else like dirt. I mean,
hmm
like you take ours, guess what? If you don't sell them, tough, you own them, right?
hmm
You know,
hmm
the percentage, the license percentage to the developers, you know, everybody. So everybody, they were rolling in it, and they were feeling good. But you don't want every software developer to dream about somebody else as an alternative
right, right.
to spend, because they're geeks. They'll spend, they won't sleep for days, and they'll develop some crazy product just to push up an alternative platform to take you out, right?
Uh-huh,
And
uh-huh.
you, if everybody in the ecosystem is just rooting for
For
somebody else,
right.
they'll even kind of work together to try to create a new competitor. I mean, you see it happen
Mm,
all the time,
mm.
and to jack up a competitor. I mean, you saw this with. I mean, Apple's gotten better at this, but Apple has a long history of
Yeah.
pulling defeat out of the jaws of victory by just being, you know, too abusive to the and it's important. I mean, obviously you don't want to just give it all away, but you want to be thoughtful,
Yeah.
and you want
How
to make people pause before they encourage
yeah.
an an alternative to what, if you're sharing the spoils in a fair way.
How would you think, and I realize we've taken up more time than we had reserved with you, but if I can keep you on for
Sure.
another minute or two. So how would you think about that, about what is a sustainable amount of value for me to extract for being the initiator, one of, the earlier stage? Yeah.
You know, so I don't think there is like a mathematical formula. I think you really, it's a
Yeah.
question of the,
Mhm.
it's like scale. It's all relative, right?
Yeah.
It's a question of whether because you're going to be interacting with a bunch of different people in the ecosystem. And look, if it is a, if the person, if you're dealing with one level of the ecosystem, which, as I said, is just completely competitive and it's a
Yeah.
commodity business, you don't need to throw them anything, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
No.
but uh, but usually it's more complicated than that, right?
Yeah.
And it's really a function of, again, thinking through what would they do or what could they do, or if they
Mhm,
consolidated,
mhm.
if that level consolidated, would that change the dynamic?
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and it, you know, so
Yeah.
it really is a question of the the relative contribution.
Yeah, and then all this switching costs, the minimum scale, all of that stuff comes into the equation. Um, Fascinating. Okay, this has been really uh, really eye opening for me. It's kind of putting together I mean, seeing how your model can apply. It's the same model I think works. It's just the sources of the advantages might be different.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
awesome. So I think we have to close up now. I think we've reached the top of our time with you. Jonathan, thank you so much. What I really appreciate about your work is that, there are a lot of kind of uh, theoreticians who study, but I really respect when there's someone who actually puts their money on the line or other people's money on the line and actually has to make bets and then live with those bets. The clarity of the thinking that comes from growing up in that with that kind of accountability is really refreshing.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan.